This week we're going to be discussing Chapter 10, Preschool Policies and Practices, as well as two of the required readings, the Spalding et al. Article on eligibility criteria for language impairment and the Dolligan and Campbell article on non-word repetition tasks. So, policies and practices and preschool. Child Find requires that all students with disabilities be identified, and it applies to children ages 3 to 5 when regarding to preschool, and it extends until age 21 for school-age children. But these are all the policies outlined and defined under IDEA 2004. IDEA outlines and identifies the transition from IFSP to IEP. The Local Education Agency, or LEA, must conference not less than 9 days before the child's third birthday to discuss the transition from IFSP to IEP and whether or not that child continues to be eligible for services. Because when they move from early intervention into school age, the criteria for eligibility may change slightly. Usually, if a child is eligible for early intervention, they should be continuing to be eligible in schools, but you don't always see that. So, testing is required when they're moving from the early intervention into the IDEA, IEP stages. So, they are tested and they have to meet the criteria and qualifications for language speech impairment under the Mississippi Department of Education policies. So, that is something for consideration. But the LEA must provide a detailed explanation of differences between the IFSP and the IEP. Primarily, of course, IFSP is family-centered, and the IEP incorporates the academic component, addressing pre-literacy, language, school readiness, and numeracy skills. And the family may elect to continue to receive the IFSP, but they can choose to go to the IEP as well. Now, of course, the IFSP couldn't continue into the school age. By the time they turn school age and enter school, it would have to move into the IEP stage. Another note that 90 days, that is the typical timeline for evaluation and IEP development. Once you receive parental consent for testing, you have 60 days to evaluate and diagnose the child if they're eligible for services. And if they're eligible for services, you have 30 days from the eligibility determination to conduct and hold the IEP. So that 90 days is a consistent timeline throughout IDEA policies and procedures. So, service delivery models for preschool. There are various models that you can operate under. Generally, a lot of times you work with direct services, small group, or one-on-one with clinicians. But you also have roles in indirect services, which is working with parents and preschool teachers to facilitate language development. Preschool teachers don't have a lot of training like we do in language development and language enhancement and how to create ideal language learning environments. So it's very critical for us to get in there and train those preschool teachers on how to develop those language skills. So we want to teach parents to engage in scaffolding, such as the shared book reading components. The book uses a specific example of language as the key constructive interactions around books and play. It's a parent training program. Of course, that's just one of many that are out there, or you can just use your own clinical knowledge and methods to train parents. But that's a specific program designed and it has been researched on how to train parents on how to do shared book reading and develop language through those skills. You want to encourage parents to communicate at home using the language they know best if they're dual language learners. And this book talks about, in this particular method on page 270, the CAR acronym: comment on your child's interests, ask questions about those interests, respond to your child's utterances by adding a little bit more information. So that is following the scaffolding model that we've been talking about. I say it, you say it, we say it is another way you could think about that. But it's child-centered, it's play-based, it's context-driven based on what the child is interested in. But you need to train parents in how to not only develop those early language skills, but also to support emergent literacy skills. And when you train parents on how to do shared book reading tasks and talk about language through books, The research has shown that children's grammatical complexity and expressive language scores can increase after 6 weeks of dialogic reading, with differences maintained at the 9-month follow-up. That's at the bottom of page 270, regarding a specific study by Whitehurst in 1988. So the parents are trained in dialogic reading, which is having dialogue in the reading, talking about what's being read, asking questions about it, having the child responding to the child's comments on the books. So it's very critical, but we train parents in how to do that, and can be used to develop those language skills. Regarding preschool teachers and teaching preschool teachers to scaffold language and literacy development, there are formal or informal consultation methods that you can use to prescribe to preschool teachers and help them scaffold higher level language abilities and plan language-rich environments to set the stage for literacy learning. So that would be those types of center-based language environments that are thematically driven. You have your art center, and you have your book center, and you have your imaginative play center, but not only those types of play-based, which you can see a lot in other preschool methods, such as the Montessori method, but how do we maximize the opportunities in those play-based centers to grow their language and their skills? So there's can be teacher-facilitated language scaffolding, but there also can be peer-facilitated language scaffolding that we'll talk about in a second. But children benefit most when teachers present language forms and functions slightly in advance of the current skills to stretch their zones of proximal development, or ZPDs. So you need to help teachers to maximize their scaffolding techniques, such as open-ended questions, expansions, and recast. So a child says something incorrectly, or says a lower linguistic level sentence. You teach the teacher how to recast it and make it a larger expanded sentence. You to teach them how to ask open-ended questions instead of yes/no questions or basic WH questions. How do they ask? Tell me about what you're playing with right now. Tell me about your housekeeping. How do you keep the house clean when they're playing in that home-based center? And you want to do it in a variety of preschool contexts. Center time, storybook reading, snack time. It goes on to talk about the article by Justice on page 278 about the differences between high-quality scaffolding discourse focused on spoken conversation intervention versus the discourse supporting emergent literacy. Both are important, but teachers need extensive training in not only language scaffolding and general language environments, but also the emergent literacy scaffolding. The LEAP program, Literacy Environment Enrichment Program, it draws on literature that relates to the emergence of early reading and writing to experiences with spoken language and supportive environments, including methods for developing awareness of the sound structure of language. So that's one method. That's a program that you could invest in and use to train teachers. But there's many different methods. Just working with teachers collaboratively and frequently, you develop a natural relationship with those teachers on how to facilitate and develop and grow those early language skills. But it's critical that we're in those classrooms frequently, that teachers need much training. The Justice and colleagues article in the middle of page 272 in 2008, they studied where early childhood teachers attended a 2-day workshop about an emergent literacy curriculum, but received little explicit instruction in its quality implementation, meaning that they were given the information, it was presented to them, but no one actually observed them and gave them feedback on how they were implementing the program. They just got the information and they were supposed to take it and apply it into their practice. And it set 8 high-priority language literacy goals in a 36-week program: phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge, print awareness, vocabulary, linguistic concepts, narrative discourse, pragmatics, and social language. So the teachers received the training, they received supplemental lesson plans with specific objectives, they received manipulatives, access to videos and websites, and video equipment. But they didn't see a lot of growth necessarily because no one actually went in like you're doing in clinicals right now. You're doing therapy and you're applying your knowledge, and there's a supervisor watching you and giving you immediate feedback about how you are implementing your knowledge and whether or not you're implementing it correctly, or if there's something that you need to adjust and do differently, and to order maximize that language instruction. When you're not giving those teachers that immediate feedback, even if it's as simple as the correct production of the phonemes. Of course, teachers don't know to produce s instead of s, and they have that schwa ending. They've never been taught that. So even something as simple as that could affect those language and literacy outcomes in pre and post test measures. So they need that systematic, explicit instruction and training. And this is similar to what I found in my dissertation as well. When I trained teachers in phonological awareness principles, we didn't see a lot of growth because we just did a half-day workshop, much structured much like general professional development is in schools. And the teachers did not grow as much as I would like for them to have grown after training, because we weren't going in there and giving them feedback on how they were implementing the phonological awareness instructional principles. Now, I've come back 5 years later and done that again. I know we talked about it earlier this semester, and they are doing much better with that, and their level of knowledge has greatly increased. And I believe it's due to the fact of how they're implementing the interventions in the classroom and being able to see those explicit interventions implemented. You learn when they're teaching. So preschool teachers need a lot of training with more specific, ongoing, and interactive training that can be provided through than what's provided through a 1 or 2 day workshop. They also need consultation regarding precise use of metalinguistic terms, such as differentiating speech sounds from letters. So many times I say, what sound does boat start with? And the kid goes, B. And I'm going, okay, that's the letter name. Tell me the sound, because teachers aren't using that language in their classroom environments. Okay, so continuing to talk about service delivery models, we can teach peers to scaffold language and literacy and play. So you can use the more able and well-adjusted peers. They can be engaged to scaffold language, literacy, and social abilities of peers with disabilities. You just help facilitate that conversation, and then move towards them independently scaffolding those conversations. And you can see the difference between, in figure 10.2, between a peer scaffolded conversation versus a clinician scaffolded. And I was reading and I was going, wow, that peer scaffolded language was much larger, much more expansive than sample A was, than sample B. But then if you look at sample B's child characteristics, the child that was sample B, he had much more significant issues than the child in sample A. So, I found it interesting that sample B child Josh was apraxia of speech and sensory integration difficulties, but he had marked language and syntactic deficits that you could see in his language skills versus the kid in sample A. You also have direct services in classrooms and clinic settings that can be provided by the clinician. So it talks about the differences between an inclusion model and a traditional pull-out model with speech-language services, and that would be the SLP going into the classroom versus the SLP pulling them out into their room or going into a clinic setting. And it found that classroom-based instruction generalized target words better to home environments than the clinical pull-out setting, but both were just as effective in the child's growth and skills. So you see a lot of opposition a lot of times from more traditional SLPs about doing push-in therapy. And it is difficult, but you can see good results when you do push in or inclusive services by doing just simple, the way I do it is if I go into a preschool or kindergarten classroom, I'll go to a table in the room that would be one of their center tables or one of their small group tables and implement my services there in the classroom while the teacher is doing her academic instruction and while the teacher assistant might be doing some additional academic support or center time instruction. So preschool and kindergarten classrooms are designed for push-in models and methods because they're doing small groups and centers, and they're changing those centers every 30 minutes usually. You find more difficulty in implementing this in the higher grade levels, especially if the teacher uses the traditional whole class instructional methods. Then you might not be able to pull them into a small group to do your intervention services. And but we also find that whole classroom instruction isn't really as effective as small group instruction. So we do a lot of training on how the older grades can implement small group instructional methods, just as well as the kindergarten classrooms can. So there's also evidence for more intensive scheduling of services that can be more effective, such as block scheduling. And this is where the example they use in the book, that the children would receive, they went 24 sessions delivered over 6 months. That one group had 4-day intensive treatment schedule clustered into a 3-week blocks delivered in both halves of the 6-month period. So you had 3 weeks initially and then maybe 3 weeks at the end. And then the traditional over 6 months, once to 2 times a week, 24 sessions total. And they found that the children had equal amount of growth whether they received that block scheduling of services or whether they received that traditional every week type of pull out therapy. So intensive scheduling could be preferable for reducing measurable gains in language expression. Now, the implications for actual practice implementing that in schools is rather difficult. I do use the model of block scheduling for, say, artic drilling for your mild articulation kids. Go in 5 minutes a day, just drill them on that sound so they're not necessarily coming out and playing your game for 30 minutes and then going back to the class. It's just 5 minutes, words, boom, 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 and then you leave. And I usually get about 20 productions of the target words and sentences by doing that articulation drilling. But to only give services for 3 weeks to a student on an IEP and then not serve them for 2 months and then come back and give services for another 3 weeks might be a little bit difficult for parents to understand that justification. We're not there yet in Mississippi. I'm not saying we might not get there in the future, but we're not there yet. So assessment in preschool. You can use formal tests, parent report measures, and language samples combined to assess language. And it's very important that you use all of these measures combined, as we'll talk about the formal test implications in a second. The Table D in Part 3 appendix, which would be on starting on page 517, gives you a list of common language tests available for children, not just necessarily age 3 to 5, but ages 3 to 21. So that is an important reference for you to have. So the book talks about the Spalding et al. Article from 2006 about test sensitivity and specificity and cut scores. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more extensively towards the end, but just some highlights from this section. You want 80% or better, 0.8 identification accuracy. And only 5 tests of all the 43 tests that the manuals they examined had met that criteria for test sensitivity and specificity in identifying language impairments accurately. You want to consider cut scores, and the use of cut scores, of course, the school policies outline that you must have 1.5 standard deviations below the mean to qualify for a language disorder, but that use might not always be accurate, so you need multiple measures. And but again, you have to have one formal test for eligibility, but you need other supporting documentation to justify the needs for services, because some kids are always going to score in that 1.5 or 2 standard deviations below the mean, but they're not always going to be eligible for language services. There's also test bias problems. All formal tests are biased. This can be due to lack of exposure of cultural specific things and concepts for certain children from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds. But so it's not only lack of exposure about that makes formal test bias, but also the lack of experience with forms of discourse and test expectations involved in test taking. So what the skill is the test wants you to do. Children from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds might not understand that implications. So this is where dynamic assessment techniques come in. And I'll probably talk about this a little bit more when we get to the school section. For instance, dynamic assessment for preschool, you're not going to do response to intervention at the preschool level. You could utilize dynamic assessment techniques, but if a child has significant enough language delays to be referred to you in preschool, then more than likely it's better just to go ahead, assess and evaluate and potentially treat if they meet the criteria than implementing these techniques, because we know how critical early intervention services are. Dynamic assessment could be very beneficial in preschool, especially for children from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, but I don't know how practical it is to implement it at the preschool level when you're talking about the services delivered from the school aspect. but you don't want to over-identify children by any means. I just don't see a lot of children in preschool diagnosed with language impairment who aren't truly language impaired. I feel like the ones that I receive truly have those deficits, so that really wouldn't apply. Dynamic assessment wouldn't apply to those types of children. But it can be used for children from diverse linguistic backgrounds, and it follows the test, teach, retest procedures, such as in response to intervention. You would do some sort of criterion reference measured or curriculum based measure when they get to the curriculum. It could be telling a narrative, and you see how good the child is at developing a narrative and score that appropriately. And then for a period of 2 to 4 weeks, very brief, you teach them how to develop their narratives and expand it. Use your traditional scaffolding type of language instruction, whether it be through the teacher or you as the SLP or the parent, anyone involved in that child's environment. And then you come back and give the same test that you did at the beginning and see if they've shown any growth. And children who are not language impaired, who are just culturally and linguistically deprived, will show growth on these measures versus the children who have true language deficits won't. And another method of this that you can use for culturally linguistically diverse children is non-word repetition, which we'll talk about in a second. So some alternatives to formal testing: you can use observation, interviews, questionnaires, and language samples to ascertain the child's language ability. So informal assessment procedures: you want naturalistic communication samples happening in their environment. Of course, again, everything's context driven. Clinicians are most successful with comments and open-ended questions to get the samples. You're not going to get a lot of yes/no, such as if you ask, do you like ice cream? They'll just say yes. They're not necessarily going to expand on it. Or where is the car going? You're not going to, that's a direct question. It's closed. They can't expand on that a lot. It's better for us to use comments. Uh-oh, the car is about to crash. Or I'll say, I went to a birthday party this weekend. I bet you've had a birthday party before. And let them talk about a birthday party. Open-ended questions. What's happening here? Using the play-based toys or pictures, even if they're at that level. And indirect invitations to comments that do not obligate a response, such as, I wonder what Spider-Man will do next. So that elicits better language samples than closed, direct questions. You want skilled clinicians have a good balance between waiting to initiate and encouraging your response, because sometimes children might seem a little withdrawn and shy and not receptive to talking to this stranger. So you want to give them an ample opportunity for language sampling and expression. So you can always, if the child seems to withdraw, you can always engage in a time of parallel play that's silent to reduce the pressures of them talking. You want to have discourse interaction and contingency techniques like recast to use to get good language samples. They can expand the child's sentence structures or even extend the child's meaning. So the same things that we do in therapy to expand their language are some of the things that we can do when trying to gather a language sample. Play contacts with dramatic play encourage language production the most, such as cars, fire trucks, playhouses, and barns. Dress up, that housekeeping center that you might see in preschools. Better than manipulative, such as blocks and clay, and drawing materials such as crayon and paper. You're not going to see a lot of preschool children who want to engage in paper pencil types of activities. Wordless picture books are good to utilize and elicit language samples. A few of the Caldecott children's books winners from the past few years are wordless picture books. Daisy and the Red Ball, The Lion and the Mouse. They're beautiful illustrations, no words, so you can just have the child tell a story about the pictures. Older preschool children are capable of longer segments of discourse. So again, those wordless picture books and story retelling can be used to get them to elicit language. And we talked about before how fear, the child might tell a story about something that they're fearful of. So you never know what you're going to get when a child starts telling you a story, because if it's something that's stuck in their mind, then it was a significant event to them. It might have been fear driven, or it might have just been something that was very different and outside of their normal routine. So you can, clinicians can use a high point technique of telling a story with a problem to elicit a similar story from a child, such as the getting stung by a bee example that they give in the book. So getting stung by a bee would be a significant event in a child's life. They would remember it. Kennedy still remembers one time when she was stung 2 years ago at a football game. So those are the types of things that they remember, and using those high point techniques of having a problem can elicit language samples from children. And then analyzing language production and comprehension in language samples. Full language transcripts provide qualitative and quantitative information that can be used not only for assessment but also to drive your therapy techniques. So you want brief targeted language samples. You could also use non-word repetition tasks that we'll talk about in a minute, such as repeating words like Dagoy Chi Biv. They used that and had good results with appropriately identified children with the more significant language deficits. So language samples document language comprehension, and in children ages 3, they have isolated states and actions. So they just will have state, maybe object action type of sentences. But age 5, they understand goal, action, outcome sequences. So you can see how that language grows and develops between the ages of 3 and 5. And by about the age of 4, end of age 4, you have full language development. They have full sentence and discourse structures, and typically developing children. So children who aren't able to tell good stories or have good sentence structure and still make significant grammatical errors at around age 4, especially age 5, you are concerned about their language development, and they potentially need those services if identified appropriately. So we go back to the first chapters of the book, the context-based assessment questions. What can the child do? So what language communication abilities are required for this young child to function well in the selected developmentally appropriate context? What is the environment? What does the context require? What are the child's current levels of functioning within this context, and what can the child do? What does the child need to do differently? What new abilities should be targeted to close gaps between what the child can do currently and what would represent better functioning in this context? And how can the context be changed? How might the context be modified to facilitate the child's development and to support more effective functioning? So we're coming back to what we've originally talked about, of context-driven questions for these stories. So now let's talk a little bit about the required reading from this week, the Spalding, Plant, and Farinell article from 2006. Eligibility criteria for language impairment is the low end of always the appropriate for CUT scores. And so they wanted to measure the use of CUT scores in diagnosing language impairment, because we know, as in Mississippi and most states, for eligibility criteria, it requires a CUT score, i.e. 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, for the child to be eligible for services. So how effective are these CUT scores and their use? So the purpose of the study was to analyze the effectiveness of using low standardized scores from language tests to diagnose language impairment in children. In their method, they used 43 norm reference language tests for ages 3 to 18. The manuals were analyzed for diagnostic accuracy, for 2 areas: CUT scores for identifying language impairment, and test sensitivity and specificity. Okay, so let's talk about the mean group differences, the use of those CUT scores. None of the test manuals reported the mean group difference between language impaired children and their normal language peers. And you may recall at some point in the semester we've talked about earlier, there's controversy over using language impaired children in norm sampling of tests. Some argue that if you include a language impaired child in your norm reference sample, then you're manipulating the test and you're not going to be able to most accurately diagnose language impaired children. Some argue that you must include the language impaired children in the norm sample so that you can have an accurate accounting of the children's abilities. So that's a big theoretical argument. You don't have to get on one side or the other with that right now, but it's something for consideration when you're looking at what this article is talking about the use of cut scores. So the tests don't report it, but 33 of the manuals did provide enough information for the authors to calculate the mean group difference. The average mean group difference was 1.34. 43% of children described as language impaired received a score that was greater than or equal to 1 standard deviation below the mean. Then 56% of children identified as language impaired received scores greater than 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So if you have children falling into that 1 standard deviation range, you might miss children that if the required cut score is 1.5 that are language impaired based on all of these other diagnostic analysis. And then again, when you talk about schools, you have to talk about significant impairment. It significantly affects them in their academic, social, vocational, or environment. So where does that fall when you're looking at eligibility criteria versus in research what constitutes a language impaired child? You as a clinician need to be the expert in making that identification and appropriate determination for services with children when in regards to those cut scores. So they found that 9 of the 33 tests reported a mean group difference of 1 standard deviation, which indicates most language impaired children score within 1 standard deviation of the mean on these tests. So that's what you're looking for if you're looking at standardized testing measures and normal curve distribution. Those children should be falling beyond 1 standard deviation. So if they're falling within 1 standard deviation below the mean, then they might be missed. There was also overlap of scores between normal developing language children and their language impaired peers. So some normal language children could potentially be diagnosed as impaired based on the cutoff criteria. So they might have lower standardized test scores and look language impaired based on a standardized test, but when you actually analyze their language samples and overall language abilities, they're not language impaired. And we definitely don't want that to happen and accurately diagnose or misidentify or over-identify children who aren't really language impaired. So cutoff scores in general, it's not an accurate or reliable means of diagnosing language impairment in children. That's why when you look at assessment, it's multifaceted. It's not just standardized scores, but it's observation of the child and their environment. It's parent interview. It's teacher input. It's actual conversational language ability and functional language ability. The whole child, not just that one score, because it's not going to be accurate measure for identifying. And then they looked at sensitivity and specificity of the test. Again, sensitivity, how accurate is it diagnosing language impaired, and how specificity, how specific it is in identifying typically language developing as typical language. Only 9 manuals of the 43 reviewed provide information on sensitivity and specificity, and of those 9, only 5 met the acceptable criterion of 80% or better accurate as described in Plant Advance 1994, and I'll be happy to provide that article to you if you like. So the 5 tests were the SELF-4, the PLS-4, the test of grammatical impairment, the test of language competence, and the test of narrative language. I love the test of narrative language for language testing because it gives you good conversational language ability. It's a narrative. They have to tell stories and they have to retell stories and answer questions about stories. And of course, you're familiar with all of with the PLS, the SELF. The test of early grammatical impairment you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a good analysis of morphosyntactic skills, and it has all of those grammatical syntactical markers that you're usually looking for in language impaired kids. And then the test of language competence I am not as familiar with since it is a 1989 test. You probably won't find that a lot in clinical settings. Now, these criteria can be easily calculated based on information provided in most test manuals, and the authors demonstrate how to calculate test sensitivity and specificity. And sensitivity and specificity still appears to provide the most accurate means of standardized test reliability, but test manuals still aren't reporting it for some reason. Even the new version of OWLS that came out 2 years ago doesn't have sensitivity and specificity reported. Now, if a test is highly sensitive to identifying children with language impairment and specific to identifying typical children, it can be used as a good measure to compare children to peers. But if out of 43 tests that we analyzed, only 5 met that criteria and only 9 even reported sensitivity and specificity, how are we accurately determining the types of tests that we're using to identify language impairment? Do we just pick a test because we like the way it looks and we feel like it's a good measure, or are we actually analyzing its overall validity on the types of measures that we want for language impairment? So it's a lot of things to consider from the diagnostic aspect, and I thought this was a good time to talk about this in a little bit more in depth. Another thing too is if you're looking at sensitivity and specificity, 80% is our cut. So that's 80% or more of the children who are actually language impaired will be appropriately diagnosed. Well, that still leaves 20% that could potentially be misdiagnosed, that can fall into the, hey, I get into that language cut score of 1.5, but really I'm a typical language kid, or vice versa. The typical, the language impaired child falls above that 1.5 cut score, and it's only 80% specific in identifying typical language. So you could have somebody who is language impaired identifies typical language. That's a hard concept even for us to grasp, much less to explain to a parent. And we had a situation recently where the child had qualified in the clinical setting. I felt like if you looked at the overall total language ability, including the language samples, grammatical analysis, functional language skills, child's ability level, the whole package, that even though that child fell into that 77 standardized score range, he probably wasn't a child with a true language impairment. He probably was in that 20% that he's falling into that language impaired category, although he's not. So, but that's hard to explain to a parent when it's hard for us to grasp as clinicians. So it's just something for consideration about the principles of psychometric testing in general. So how do I know that a child is probably not a language impaired child, even if they're falling into that cut score range of 1.5 standard deviations below the mean? A task that we could use could be non-word repetition tasks. And this child that I'm speaking to could do the non-word repetition with the accuracy criteria that Dolligan and Campbell outlined in their 1998 article. So they studied the effects of non-word repetition tasks in children with language impairment. They had 20 language impaired children and age matched 20 of their normal language peers, children ages 6 to 9. They were given stimuli and asked to repeat 4 one-syllable words, 4 two-syllable words, non-words, 4 three-syllable, and 4 four-syllable words. And the results of the study revealed that children with language impairment repeated non-words significantly less accurately than their normal language peers. So let's look for a moment at some of those non-words. Here are the words that they listed. Nide, Voop, Tauge, Dife, Tabak, and I like this. One of my favorite is Degoichi Biv. Is that one of them? But there's, I think that's on the Delve sampling, but you can see here the non-words and the tasks that they were asked to do. So going back to what that criteria ended up being, the children compared the accuracy of non-word repetition tasks to identify language impairment to children of a standardized test in language impairment. The non-word repetition tasks were 95% accurate in identifying children with language impairment if they repeated less than 70% of the phonemes correctly. So you score the child based on each phoneme. Of course, the one syllable, they get 3 phonemes, and the two syllable, they might have 5 phonemes, and all the way into the larger 4-syllable words. So if they are 70% or less accurate in repeating the non-words, then they're probably more than likely a language impaired child. If the child had 81% of the phonemes correct, then he could be ruled out as having a language impairment. In contrast, the TOLD 2 was not reliable in either diagnosing a child with language impairment or ruling the child out as not having a language impairment. And that would be the sensitivity and specificity of the TOLD 2 based on their analysis. So This is just one marker of and one method of measurement amongst many that you can use to ensure that you're accurately identifying and diagnosing children with language impairment. The non-word repetition task would not be appropriate at the preschool level, but I thought it was a good time to introduce that concept about that's one method of measurement you could use to analyze the child's overall language ability. And there's a lot of theories behind why non-word repetition tasks seem to be more difficult for language impaired children. It could be the processing or the working memory deficits that they potentially have in their those parts of the brain, essentially. I don't really think that we don't need to get hung up in the why of what if it's happening in the theory of this task unless you're really interested in that. But in the research, and Dolligan and Campbell is just one of many articles you could look up about non-word repetition tasks and their ability to accurately diagnose language impaired children. And the children from culturally linguistically diverse backgrounds, if they don't have those working memory deficits or those processing deficits that we see in language impaired children, they'll be able to repeat these non-words. And in fact, we were required to do that speech, language articulation, voice and fluency screening for all first graders this year, thanks to the legislator. And one school district used non-word repetition tasks as part of their screening assessment and found that it was very accurate in identifying the children who had potential language disorders and deficits. So this can be a very effective tool in your box for language assessment measures.